Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's event on faith in a time of COVID. I'm Michael Hendricks, Director of State and Local Policy here at MI. COVID-19 has taken a toll on all of us, and it's particularly taken a toll on how, where, or even whether we worship in America. Nearly every faith community in this country has seen large drops in attendance, both physical and virtual, throughout this year. The pandemic's impact on churches, synagogues, mosques, and more, it represents a devastating blow to civil society and associational life, not to mention ourselves. It's also opened up divisions, as if politics isn't divisive enough today, on what it means to safely open our doors and even what freedom of worship entails. We have a terrific panel to discuss all these factors and questions and more. Please enter your questions throughout our discussion on whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll incorporate them into our discussion. Now, I'm pleased to welcome our first panelist, Alan Cooperman. He's the Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center. He is an expert on religion's role in U.S. politics and across the globe. It's also my pleasure to welcome Tim Dalrymple, the President and CEO of Christianity Today. Prior to his role at CT, he founded Polymath, the digital creative agency, and helped launch and lead Patheos.com, the online marketplace for religious ideas. And then last but certainly not least, Leah Zagelbaum, Vice President of Media Affairs at Agudath Israel of America, where she has served for many years. Thank you all for joining us today. All right, now Alan, I want to start with you. What is the state of religion in America today during the pandemic of COVID-19?
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for that question, and thank you and the Manhattan Institute for doing this. It's an important conversation. I really appreciate the opportunity. Well, there's no question that there's been a sea change in religious practices in the United States, forced by the pandemic. And just to put some numbers around it, in our surveys, we see that nearly 3/4 of people who, prior to the pandemic, said they went to church or another house of worship at least once a month. Nearly 3/4 of those people are now going to religious services online or watching them on TV. And just to put that, that's the equivalent. That's 3/4 of those who were attending. That's equivalent about 1/3 of all U.S. adults. So that's north of 80 million people who tell us that in the past month, the month before we did the survey, they had gone online to religious services. And about half of those people tell us that they'd done that for the first time during the pandemic. Another thing that's really interesting is that many people are not going online only to the services at the place they used to attend in person. Many people are dabbling, visiting other congregations. In fact, most tell us that they're going online either to a place other than the one they normally went to, or to some of both, going both sometimes to the one they normally went to and someplace else. So there's a lot of experimentation going on here. And virtual attendance is way, way up, while of course physical attendance is way, way down.
That's a massive sea change, as you said, in a very short amount of time. Just a quick follow-up to you. Are you seeing any ways in which that's affecting people's religious beliefs or Americans learning about the faith themselves during this pandemic? Are they changing how they exercise religious beliefs or practices? Are you seeing any changes?
Yeah, that's a very tough question for people to answer about themselves. And I think it's going to take us time to sort that out, but it's very much on our minds. And the way I'd slightly rephrase the question is, does religion thrive in hard times? And I think historically and philosophically, there's some reasons to believe that it does. Of course, there are also people who turn against faith, who question the existence of God in hard times. And empirically, there are some studies that indicate that in some parts of the world, there have been some traumatic events. For example, a great earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2011, and 2 surveys taken before and after. And they found a rise in religious identification during the period of the series of earthquakes that literally, so when the ground was moving under people's feet, they became more religious. And there is a long-term question, will that happen in the United States and around the world? And we've done some surveys on that, and it is interesting. More people tell us that their faith has been strengthened by the coronavirus pandemic than say it's been weakened. In the United States, it's about 28% who tell us their faith has been strengthened, and only 4% who tell us that their that their faith has been weakened by the pandemic. However, two things. The vast majority of people say it hasn't changed. Their degree of faith hasn't changed as a result of the pandemic. And also, the people who say their faith has strengthened are predominantly people who were already highly religious. So I think one possibility, a hypothesis that I would put out there at this point, is that what's going on is that the pandemic, or maybe in general hard times, tend to, among people who are already religious, they tend to turn to their faith, their communities for support. Of all types, psychological and practical. For those who aren't very religious, they don't. They may turn elsewhere. There isn't evidence yet, I would say, either in the United States or around the world, that the pandemic is actually causing some kind of awakening or new turn to faith among people who were not religious. But it may indeed be strengthening the faith of those who already had a predilection to be involved and for whom it was already important.
That's fascinating. Tim, I want to turn to you. At your perch at Christianity Today, are you seeing what Alan's seeing? What is the state of the church from your perspective during this pandemic?
Well, thanks for having me. I always enjoy listening to Alan, and the information coming out of Pew is really invaluable to the work that we do. You know, there are a number of stories, obviously, to be told about the impact of COVID on the church. And I'll say a little bit individually and then maybe a little bit institutionally. And individually, on the one hand, you know, this is part of the enduring strangeness of the COVID pandemic, that it is the worst of times for some and the best of times for others. And so there's one category of people, and I speak with them regularly, probably have 2 or 3 conversations like this per week, where someone says, you know, I feel kind of guilty, but the truth is it hasn't been that bad for me. I've not been impacted personally. I haven't seen people, I haven't lost people close to me. I haven't lost work. Financially, I've been just fine. And in fact, there's some things that have been kind of nice. I've enjoyed working from home. I've enjoyed seeing my family more frequently and maybe having less travel. On the other hand, there are people who've had a very, very different experience. And I think that, you know, broadly speaking, we can characterize some of these differences in terms of socioeconomic categories, ethnic categories, et cetera. These would be differently composed groups. And these are people who have seen loss of life very close to them, sometimes multiple lives lost, and they've not been able to be there with their loved ones as they've suffered through the pandemic. They've seen jobs lost. They've really wrestled with childcare as their kids weren't able to go to school, or maybe still aren't able to go to school. And in those communities, I think this has been an incredibly, incredibly trying experience. And my hunch, and Alan as a social scientist would be better equipped to kind of follow up and see whether this is the case, is that where you have people who are saying that this has really been a positive impact on their faith, it often is coming out of those who are in the midst, in the kind of the trenches of the suffering experience. And my background is as a philosopher, and my training really had to do with how do people understand suffering in light of their faith. And I would agree, I don't think there's been a reawakening, but there's maybe been a regrounding for people who are people of faith, that in the midst of our ordinary life, it's so easy to surround ourselves, fill our hours with endless distractions, right? And in the midst of a time like this, sometimes our defenses and our distractions are stripped away, and we're left in front of some of the deeper questions of life. and we reground ourselves in the things that we think are really most significant and most enduring. That's kind of on the individual level. I'll just very briefly, because I don't want to take too much time on the institutional level. On the one hand, churches have been doing so much on the ground work, providing personal protective equipment, providing food for children who formerly would have gotten those through schools, providing childcare for those who need childcare, finding ways of supporting people within their congregation, within their community. That doesn't typically make the nightly news, and yet that's been a huge part of the story for so many churches. On the other hand, and this is the final point, churches have definitely really wrestled with what are the protocols, what are navigating the political tensions, because COVID became so politicized so early, and even religious freedom issues and so forth. And we can come back to those if you wish. But I think that's been a huge part of the struggle for churches over the course of the last year, is discerning when do we stay open? Do we stay open? How do we stay open? How do we serve people? How do we deal with this navigation or this shift toward technology and remote community and so forth?
We will get back to that institutional perspective, but just to stay on the personal side for a moment, it is fascinating to think that just as people are experiencing a K-shaped economy, there's also kind of a K-shaped faith experience here in America. Some are doing well, others are clearly suffering more than others. So what about mental health vis-a-vis relationship to institutions and maybe feeling disconnected? What is the state of our souls on Zoom? Just from a personal experience, I've seen some people who were maybe marginally connected to churches, as was suggested earlier. Once they went online, it became so much easier to detach, but they weren't necessarily better off for that. I mean, so where are you seeing the state of our souls and mental health on Zoom?
So as Christians have shifted to more remote attendance of church services, then it has certainly opened up the opportunity to shop amongst churches in a different way. And not necessarily with an intention of disengaging from a particular religious community for the long term, but maybe I just want to hear what Tim Keller has to say. And it could be a sermon that's being preached now, or it could be a recorded sermon, right? Or I can
Tim Keller being a pastor in New York City.
Yes, and Andy Stanley, or maybe I want to check out kind of different denominational communities from what my typical church is. Or as in my case, I need something that my kids are able to listen to. Because suddenly I'm sitting there watching with my kids, including my 6-year-old. And so, it may be that certain preachers are more engaging for younger audiences. So I think there's a lot of that sort of shopping for what can provide the best remote church experience, with presumably an intention, and I think the data bears this out, of remaining engaged with their congregation once that picks up. But to the broader question of the state of our soul on Zoom, I mean, I think Christians have been struggling with the technologization of life as much as everybody else has. And, there was a long tradition of what you would call habitual reminders, of trying to fill your life with reminders of the presence and the goodness and the beauty of God. And Christians, generally speaking, have associated these things with sometimes with manual labor, sometimes with going out into nature, right? You go out, if you go out onto the valley floor at Yosemite, you feel your soul transported to worship God. But we don't generally feel that when we're sitting in front of our computer. And so I think there's been an attempt to, how do we find spiritual life even in the midst of a rapidly technologized age? When you feel there's this, even going back to the Desert Fathers, they would talk about, for every desire you have or everything that you're attentive to, imagine that being one eye. So you may have 1,000 eyes when you start out, because those are all the things you're paying attention to. And the point of the Christian life and asceticism is to reduce all of that to one eye that rests unceasingly upon God. And so that's why you fill your life with these reminders that harness your attention, direct them toward God. And in the midst of a world where 1,000 different things are pulling you in all different directions, and you have 1,000 voices clamoring for your attention, it's incredibly difficult to reduce your attention to that one eye. But maybe in some ways the enforced asceticism of the pandemic has enabled some people to do that a bit more than they would have otherwise.
Yeah, and it is tiring sometimes to stare into the unblinking single eye of a camera for Zoom for church, right? This is hard. Leah, I want to turn to you. Give us your perspective in the Jewish community. Obviously, you can't speak for everyone, but give us a window into what you're seeing.
Okay, so first, a little disclaimer. Not only can I not speak for everybody, I can't speak for a lot of people, but I want to make a distinction about the type of service that I'm going to be mentioning right now, and that is specifically prayer, because study in the Jewish community, there's never been a restriction on staying within your synagogue. The religious Jews pray 3 times a day in a quorum or a group of 10 men. So there's constantly groupings, and it's fluid, where somebody may daven, it's called a minyan. They may daven with 1 minyan in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, and they can pick one up at the Yankee Stadium, and they can have a set one for Shabbat. But regardless, it is a very social experience, and women are not required to pray with the minyan. I frequently pray in a room alone. So I was not subject to the same restrictions that, of congregate prayer as the men in the community. And there was the responses were varied. It's not one response. They were by and large shaped by religious observance. To a large degree, came down to interpreting what is the restriction? Is it a question of, and if I may say this in Hebrew, the requirement to guard your lives exceedingly carefully, or is it the requirement to tefillah b'tzibur, to daven in a minyan? And that tension is what informs a lot of the response to the specific restrictions of congregate prayer. So as we unpack some of this, I'd like to, look at it in that framework.
Yeah, and you are based in the New York City metro area. Would you say that there's been a particularly unique experience in the New York area, considering rules on gathering and kind of living out that tension?
Well, it's undeniable. Anybody who's following the news has seen a heightened focus on religious Jews, particularly Hasidic Jews, and that tension between the very, very restrictive guidelines. You know that the Agudath was one of the organizations that took the governor to Supreme Court over those distinctions, and won. So, everybody's just trying to navigate how to deal with a health emergency that has overtaken the globe and doing the best they can. But when those restrictions and those health concerns ram up against religion, how do we react? Well, that's what we're here to discuss and unpack. But it's been a tough ride.
I mean, so Alan, we've heard a bit of the Christian perspective, a bit of the Jewish perspective. Obviously, there's a whole lot more we could get into. So help us tease this apart. How are we seeing different branches of faith traditions in America respond to the major questions of today, particularly for COVID? Certainly, it's been a highly political season, lots of tensions. How are we seeing different branches of faith traditions respond in polling?
Well, there certainly are differences, but let me emphasize what I think are some of the commonalities. And the first one I'll say is, to me, a bit surprising. We have asked people about their satisfaction with the online worship experience, what it's like going to religious services online. And to my shock, really, the vast majority of people tell us they're either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied. 90+% of the people who are going online are either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the online religious experience. Just 8% tell us they're either not too or not at all satisfied. Now, I got to tell you, the synagogue that I go to is a Reformed Jewish synagogue. So unlike Orthodox Jews, we actually, our services are online, our Sabbath services, including the Torah reading, which I know is not, it's anathema to do that in the Orthodox world, but Reformed Jews do that. And I go to those services. I love my synagogue, but I'm not really very satisfied with that online experience myself. It's just not the same. I mean, I really like being there in a shul with other people and seeing them before and after. And that's a big part of the experience for me. So I've been surprised by how satisfied most people say they are. The other thing, in terms of, I listened very carefully to what Leah had to say, including the Hebrew. But I think if I could simplify it, the way I heard it, is that for many people, there's a tension, and maybe not only between different people, but even within people, a tension between wanting to protect their health and wanting to fulfill their religious obligations or have satisfying spiritual and religious lives. And, that's a natural tension, like that's real in this time, because to a certain extent, you can't fully have both. I mean, or a person like me can't fully have both. So clearly some people are really satisfied with the online experience. So maybe they feel like they can have it all, and maybe they even like it because they can do it in their pajamas or whatever, and they can take a bathroom break and they can turn down the volume if the sermon's going too long. I don't know. Maybe some people really love it, but for many people, it's not fully satisfying. And so they're torn, and you either go in person and then you have some risk to yourself and risk to others, risk to the community, and so I'm telling you something that we all know. But against that backdrop, what's kind of interesting is that there's really a lot of consensus. We find 8 in 10 Americans tell us that they think that houses of worship should be under exactly the same social distancing rules as other businesses and other organizations in their local area. Now, there are, 1 in 5 Americans, 19%, who say that they think that religious organizations should be given more flexibility. And that's interesting. And I think that's a reflection. That's a minority, but what's what I would call a substantial minority. 1 in 5, 20%. That's not nothing. And I think what's going on there is these are people who tend to be more religious. A lot of evangelical Protestants, for example, in this group, a lot of regular Mass attending Catholics, for example, in this group. And these are people who really value in their own lives and for their communities the in-person worship experience. So not only Orthodox Jewish men who must gather in person in a minyan in order to fulfill their daily religious obligations, but for Mass attending Catholics, you can't take communion virtually. Ditto in slightly different way for many Protestants and members of other faith groups. So there's a portion of people who feel that religious organizations actually ought to be given more leeway because of their special role in individuals' lives and in our society. But that's not the majority. 80% say religious organizations should be under exactly the same rules. Now, not necessarily any more strict, by the way, not greater restrictions on religious groups than in other, but the same as others in their local area.
Tim, are you seeing that? Oh, go ahead, Leah.
I was going to clarify something. First, I would like to respond when you said how much you missed the socialization of the shul experience. What was interesting to me, as much as I just said I don't need to be part of a minyan, I do go to minyan every Shabbos. I missed it so much that what surprised me was how intensely religious I am. It's something that I grew up with. It's something that's in the back of my life always. And the emotional distress of not being able to participate in religious services, it took me a little bit by surprise.
Let me jump in and say that's brilliant, brilliantly said, Leah. And I'm sure there are lots of people out there like me just nodding and saying, yeah, and you know what, that could be part of the explanation for why 28% of Americans say COVID-19 actually has strengthened their faith. It could be because, and I'm just making this up, I don't know, we do polling questions. We don't really have the ability to then interrogate the individuals and say, well, why did you say that? That's a whole nother polling question, and you can't develop those in advance. But it could be that what's going on is that for some people, the restrictions and that they're feeling, and the alienation or dissociation or atomization that we're feeling in our society, partly as a result of this, our social distancing, is making people recognize just how much they really did enjoy being part of a religious community. And of course, it makes sense that that would be concentrated among those who were active in religious communities. People who weren't active in religious communities are they're not missing it in this moment. Those for people for whom it's been an important part of their lives in all kinds of ways, yeah, they're maybe really missing it.
Mm. Tim, is this what you're seeing too? I mean, what have been the differences between major Christian denominations, or to put it another way, between mainline evangelical Catholic communities in America on the questions, particularly of COVID, maybe COVID restrictions too? What are you seeing?
Well, I want to mention one other way of differentiating those communities, and that is the ethnic differentiation. That I think that we have seen a very disparate impact, not only individually and economically, but in church communities. If you are attending a predominantly Hispanic American congregation or African American congregation, where a lot of those folks have seen greater impact on their work, more exposure to the virus, and therefore higher death rates. And so the churches have had to wrestle with those things. It's also been the case that it was largely the churches that were well resourced and already leaning into technological innovation that were able to make a relatively seamless transition into a remote church experience, an online church experience. Whereas a lot of those that, they may have bivocational pastors, and those bivocational pastors may need to be scrambling in order to keep their own family afloat. They may have a congregation that takes a greater hit financially, and so they're not able to give to the same amount that they would ordinarily have given, or they may just not really be equipped or even interested in being equipped for online worship experiences. And now suddenly, they have no way to convene or to gather. So I think that's one very important way in which we've seen a disparate impact. Alan mentioned one of the most important factors, I think, when it comes to Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox, and that has to do with kind of the height of your view of the Eucharist or communion or Lord's Supper. If you are, if you attend a congregation or you're a part of a denomination that really feels that, for us as a family at home, to put together juice and bread and to participate symbolically together with our community in taking the Lord's Supper or the communion is just fine. If you're a part of those communities, then you're going to have a little bit less of a sense that we really need to get together because we need the priest to bless the body and the blood of Christ. Otherwise, it's not really the Eucharist. But I want to just emphasize, I think, the point that that Alan ended with, that you take something for granted when you've had it every week for as long as you can remember. And when suddenly it's stripped away, or at least changed beyond all recognition, I think you do recognize just how much it meant to you to get together. For us, for evangelical Protestants, and certainly for other Christian groups, and I'm sure this applies outside Christianity as well, part of the singing together, the corporate worship, that's something you really don't experience at home. You've got maybe yourself and your spouse, and maybe you have a couple kids at home, and you're not carried up in the voices of the congregation in the same way. And that is a very important part of the worship experience. So you're able to have the sermon, you're able to have some other parts of the experience, but that the socialization as well as the worship are really profoundly different.
That's so interesting you mentioned that. Let me just jump in there and say something. Of course, we've been talking about kind of as though there's a dichotomy. Either you go in person or you don't go in person, and those are the two choices. But in fact, in-person attendance can also be subject to various restrictions, right? And we know this. We've asked respondents in surveys who are going in person to their religious services, whether there's social distancing, whether there's mask wearing required, whether there's a limit on the number of people, and whether there are limits on singing, because respiratory illness, we all know, and we know from some big cases, singing expels a lot, and can maybe increase the chances of transmission of COVID-19. So we've asked people both what their houses of worship are doing by way of restrictions and what they think they should be doing. And it's kind of interesting, to Tim's point, that let's put it this way, the least popular and the least common restriction is a restriction on singing. I think that's interesting. I'm not going to claim to be Anthony Fauci, so I don't know which of these restrictions is actually the most important, and all that. Clearly, mask wearing, social distancing seem to be important in limiting transmission of the disease. But I think it's interesting that singing is not something people who go in person seem to want the singing. That may be a big part of why they go in person. And and I have to acknowledge from my own experience and experience of friends, the singing when you're in your own house and you're singing, it's just not the same as a whole lot of people singing or chanting in the Hebrew tradition around you.
I can attest to my singing just not quite being the same. So we're getting a lot of great questions from the audience. Please keep sending them in. I'm going to go in order from the ones that we've received. One of the questions from Tony, Tim kind of addressed it already, asking about who's doing the best, most interesting ministry online. Tim, I'll have another follow-up question for you, and you can feel free to address that. But Tim, there's another question from Lupe about church attendance, saying the church attendance has been in decline for decades. How do you think this experience will affect attendance going forward? What do you think?
Well, I think it inflects what we even mean by attendance, and how do we count in-person attendance as well as online attendance. And I think that a lot of churches that I'm aware of saw in the early weeks and months of the COVID pandemic that their attendance online at that point, for most of them, was steady and strong, and maybe even higher than what it had been when they were solely or predominantly in person. Then they saw some drop off. That wasn't necessarily people who were not doing anything during that hour, but in many cases were people who were recognizing, well, I could actually listen to any sermon I want now, and so the socialization, the worship is not as much a part of my experience. It really kind of comes down to the sermon when it's online. And so, well, I could listen to anybody. And so I'm going to try this out. I'm going to explore the smorgasbord a little bit. So a lot of churches, I think, saw some diminishment of their attendance as the pandemic wore on. Many have stabilized, and the data that they have collected from their own congregations has been that everybody really intends to come back when it's back to in person. Now, do I think that this accelerates? I think it's maybe above my pay grade, really, to speculate on that. Does it accelerate decreasing church attendance? I think in many ways it may have invited new audiences in that wouldn't have known about it otherwise. There may be people on the other side of the pandemic who find themselves really looking for meaning and community, who are going to join church communities who had not done so previously. And then I think there will be some who just feel like, well, I switched to online and I didn't really miss it. And then, or, I switched to online and I didn't really enjoy it. And so I didn't really do much of anything. I didn't attend anything, even online. And those folks, whether they eventually find their way back to regular church attendance, I think is up to God and history, and I'll have a hard time predicting the outcome of that.
Let me jump in there too, if I can, and sort of second what Tim said, but maybe throw some statistics in as well. So, as I said at the outset, there definitely is a sea change, and nationally, there's no question that online virtual attendance is much higher than it was in the past. More houses of worship are streaming their services than in the past, and many more people are going online. Roughly half of people who were at least occasional attenders in the past basically are going online instead of going in person now. And as I said, half of the people online are have started going for the first time during the pandemic. So there's no question that the audiences online are up. We have asked people in our surveys, now, when this is all over, what do you think you're going to do? Are you going to go online more often than you did in the past? Are you going to go in person more often than you did in the past? And what we find is the vast majority of people tell us that they're going to go in person about as often as they did before the pandemic. It's actually, there are some people who say they're going to go online more, and there's some people who say they're going to go in person more than in the past, but it's a minuscule share of people. It's only 2% of those who who routinely attend, anyway, like even once a month, who say that in the future they expect to go online more and go in person less than they did before the pandemic. Now, of course, people may not be the best predictors of their own behavior. And when you're pent up and you have this pent up desire to do something, you may overstate how much you're going to do it when reality hits. And when that day comes, and we don't know how long that's going to be for the whole country, it may be that people will have gotten used to going online. And maybe, so I, like Tim, I'm not going to predict, but I will tell you that most people do intend to go back to in-person attendance and at the same rates that they did in the past. There's another interesting question, which is donations, by the way. Now because asking people about exactly how much money they donate is a sort of difficult question to ask. It seems maybe intrusive to people. We don't ask about exact amounts, but we have asked whether people are giving more or less now during COVID to their church or other house of worship than they did before COVID. And most people say they're giving the same amounts, but we get more people who say they're giving less than who say they're giving more. So I don't know what the actual amounts are. I'm not saying that church revenues are necessarily down, but those data would indicate that more people are giving less.
Alan, we have a quick question from the audience, Michael from the audience, and then I'll come to you, Leah. Are we seeing attendees online not just sample other churches, try out other churches, as Tim mentioned, but are we also seeing them, or is there any evidence of people trying out other denominations, maybe even other faiths?
I don't know, because we didn't ask the question that way. We did ask whether, when people go online, whether they're going online to the congregation or house of worship that they usually attended before the pandemic, or whether they're going someplace else, or both. So we have that, but I don't know about kind of crossing lines. And I'll note, even in the question, it's kind of interesting. What does it mean to cross a denomination or to cross a faith? Because the question says, are Reformed Jews going to Orthodox online teaching? And from my point of view, that's not a different denomination or a different faith. Those are, important, I suppose, branches or streams within Judaism, but it's not like Jews going to Christian worship. But this gets a little more complicated if you think about Catholics going to Protestant services or Protestants going to Catholic services, or that kind of thing. Is my guess, and it is just a guess based on anecdotal, is that mostly people are doing some visiting at places that they've heard about and are curious about, and probably mostly within their own, let's put it this way, broad faith traditions. I have not heard about people, checking out really very different faith traditions, although some of that may happen. But I've certainly heard about people who moved across the country at some point and remember their congregation back on the West Coast, or they're, in Chicago or whatever, wherever they used to live. And they're using this opportunity to kind of reconnect with a congregation that they used to be part of. And they used to think, well, I don't live there anymore. Why? I can't go to services there. But now they realize, oh yeah, actually I can dip in and be part of the, that their old community. So I hear about a lot of that.
Mm-hmm. Leah, this is another question from the audience, from Michael from the audience, and feel free to address this to whatever degree you feel comfortable. But the question is, do you sense any greater tensions within the Jewish community around the willingness to comply with civil laws? In other words, are some Jewish communities upset with the Orthodox around distancing or assembly regulations? What's your perspective on that?
So it's an important question, and I'm going to tackle it, and I hope I do it justice. But the quick answer is, sure, there were tensions. There were tensions not just from, Karen in Prospect Park to any other person in Prospect Park, but within the Orthodox Jewish community, from outside the Orthodox Jewish community, neighbor to neighbor, there was disagreements as to how people were handling different issues. But I want to make a distinction between religious observance and demographics. The visibly Orthodox among us, Hasidim in particular, because of what we said about Minyan and Shabbos, on Shabbos there are restrictions against traveling. Orthodox Jews do not go on cars, on subways, on buses. We walk, and we don't carry things in the street either. And this is a conversation for a different time, but what it means is that we live in walking distance of our shuls, and therefore we live in close-knit communities. And then we're very family oriented. So a Hasidic family could have easily 11, 12, 13, 14 children. So there are issues that might not be religious in nature, but more just cultural demographics. When you start looking at the incidence of virus spread and household density, and they're just things that come into play that could have an impact. And Orthodox Jews are mysterious. Most people don't really know what goes on in the service. So when that comes up against, a scary pandemic, I believe that did all coalesce to create some of the tension. Now, a lot of these synagogues were extremely strict about distancing and about hygiene and about mask wearing. Some, including Agudath, even more so than the CDC. We interpreted V'nishmartem ma'odis nafsho sechem as saying it's okay, whatever the governor says is law, but we have a higher responsibility to go beyond that and to safeguard lives to the best that we can. The rest of it, some of it, I believe, was sensationalism of trying to find a few bad actors and highlighting them. And you saw that, that was out there, and it made for a good story. But for the most part, we're all in this together. Everybody is battling this horrible, horrible virus that is decimating. It's just making its way across all communities. And to come back to the question, are there greater tensions within the Jewish community? There are tensions. It's not about complying with civil laws. It's about balancing life in a new time and new reality.
Well said. Tim, just to slightly shift gears, but Leah talked about children, assembly. A lot of churches have schools, and so as much as churches are trying to navigate how to pursue worship as a church, they're also trying to think about how to educate children as well. I mean, what are you seeing about the state of education, faith-oriented education during COVID?
Well, it's a great question, and maybe I can start by addressing some of what Leah was addressing, and then I'll come specifically to education, because I think we Christians are the younger sibling to the Jewish people, and we really see some of the similar tensions. When the pandemic was first settling in across the world, I co-authored something with Walter Kim, the head of the National Association of Evangelicals, encouraging people that it is okay to move to online services. Now, we did that very early on, and I think that we saw a pretty high percentage of churches that were complying with that. Not that they were obligated to us, but obviously there were rules in local jurisdictions. Complying with that in the early going, and felt certainly under a kind of an emergency scenario, it makes sense for us. I think as the pandemic stretched on and lockdown protocols stretched on, a lot of people began to wrestle with their obligations to, particularly New Testament encouragements to gather together regularly for teaching of the word and for the building up of the body of Christ. And, at what point are we not being faithful to what our faith requires us to do? And at what point does it become so damaging to people psychologically and spiritually to be cut off from their usual sources of meaning and encouragement and hope and faith? That, there was a question over there, I think, along these lines as well, of the psychological consequences and the rise of suicides and deaths of despair, and just the numbers of people who are going to seek out mental health related prescription medications or counseling. And we certainly, all of the evidence that I've seen suggests that there has been a tremendous strain placed upon people, and churches, of course, were some of the institutions that helped to address that strain. And so I very much understand the tension that a lot of churches have felt. There have been some that I think have been kind of flouting the rules entirely, and I don't think they've exactly covered themselves in glory. But, to the point that was made earlier, a lot of it does have to do with how do you feel, are you being treated fairly relative to other organizations? So there were churches in California, for instance, that felt like, okay, the strip club down the street is able to be open and yet we're not. How is that fair? Don't we provide something that's more valuable to society than that? And some of that, I don't know all of the details around it, but I know that was a very real perception and sentiment for a lot of churches that really felt like what we do is essential. We should be considered essential and able to be open at least as much as a lot of other organizations are. So some of it, I think, had to do with that feeling of fairness that, okay, well, if we're not going to be able to meet, at least treat us the same as you're treating these other organizations, and a feeling that at least in some, more progressive context, they weren't getting that same kind of consideration. Now to the question real quickly on education. My impression is that the vast majority of private schools, including parochial schools and Protestant schools, have done everything that they could to stay open. Partly, there's certainly a different financial incentive structure for private schools versus public schools. But also partly, I think they just feel like this is a part of their service to their community, that if they were to shut down, that all of their parents would, some of them, maybe, one partner would have to stop working, and that would be difficult for them financially. And so I think that in the Christian education space, those have been much more inclined to stay open. And most of what we've seen at the college level has been really successful management of transmission. So I live right down the street from Wheaton College, and they've really had wonderful success with keeping open and managing matters so that there weren't significant outbreaks.
Mm. And Alan, I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't recognize that, to state the obvious, faith traditions in America do constitute more than just Christian or Jewish. I mean, there's Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, you name it. Are you seeing these same sort of tensions and questions arising in other faith traditions? I want to make sure that we address this. Have you been polling on this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm at the mercy of the data and don't like to speculate too much about things I really can't talk about. Let me put it this way. I think there's no reason to think that other non-Christian and smaller religious groups aren't experiencing all the same things. I got no evidence that they wouldn't be. But the reality is that in our polling, especially once we narrow down to people who do go to religious services or who are active in religious communities, which already cuts our sample sizes, we don't typically have enough people in some of these smaller religious groups to talk about them as a reliable sample. And I hope you'll recognize that that's being responsible, not irresponsible. It's not that we wouldn't want to, but let's suppose that in a survey we had 5 women in Wisconsin. Would we feel that we could talk about what women in Wisconsin think based on what 5 women in Wisconsin tell us? It's sort of the same thing if we're talking about groups like Hindus or Buddhists in America. We have them, they're included in our surveys. We don't exclude them, but typically we don't have enough of them that we can treat them as a reliable sample. We do have enough Jews in our, because Jews are about 2% of the US population, so we get enough Jews. We have enough people who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to be able to talk about that group, sometimes called Mormons. But we get to smaller groups, and especially the smaller non-Christian groups, which are at 1% or less of the U.S. population, unless we're either aggregating data from multiple surveys or building special super large surveys, we can't talk about them. But having said that, I do hope that by the end of the pandemic, whenever that comes, we will have asked these questions multiple times, and it might be that that we'll begin to, if we aggregate data, have enough to be able to include, to reliably report on groups like Muslims. But I don't think it's so different. Basically, I see no reason to be. The more you look at various religious groups in America, you see the same basic kinds of patterns. You see, for example, that in general, younger people are less religious than older people. You see that people who are married to someone of the same religious group tend to be more religious. You see changes over the life cycle, whereas people get older, they tend to become a little bit more religious. You see rising shares who don't identify with any religion among younger Americans. So actually a really large group, and that we can talk about, is Americans who don't identify with any religious group, sometimes called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S.
Separate from Catholic nuns.
Quite separate from Catholic nuns. Kind of like the opposite of Catholic nuns. And and people who identify within that group as atheist and agnostic, and there's a growing share of Americans, and we should take their views into consideration as well. And typically, actually, we can. We do have enough of some of these non-religious groups in our surveys. But when we're talking about things like online religious experiences, we don't factor them in very much because we tend to base the discussion, sort of the denominator for the figures, is among people who normally go to religious services. So if atheists and agnostics, with relatively few exceptions, are not routinely going to religious services to begin with, so COVID-19 hasn't affected their experience or and hasn't strengthened their faith or weakened their faith.
All right, so shifting gears in the time that we have, Leah, I want to turn to you. What do you see, perhaps personally, as what reopening should look like? At some point, a vaccine for COVID-19 will have rolled out to a much larger share of the population than has been able to access it so far. We will get back to normal or some new normal. What should reopening look like? What do you hope to see next for the Jewish community, particularly in New York City?
So you just asked me 2 questions. You asked, what do I think personally, and what do I see for the community? And I'm going to tell you that I think the answer is the same. What I hope to see, without the specific techniques or what the steps are incrementally to how we open, what I hope to see is mindfulness. This, whether you called it, I think Tim called it a reawakening, and Alan said regrounding, or excuse me if it was the other way. It was an understanding of what religion means to us, of how much it brings to our lives, and how much we owe to our religious observance, and the ability to integrate that into what we do and how we do it and how we face the day and the decisions that we make. And if anything, the pandemic has been a wake-up call on so many levels that I hope that as we go forward, that on religious observance, it will encourage us to understand why we do what we do and how we do it, and to do it better and more in keeping with what religion and health calls for.
Well said. Tim, what is at stake, in your opinion, for wider communities? Let's assume you're a policymaker, or maybe someone who's just not part of the Christian community, let's say. Certainly, religion is, religious organizations are part of the institutions of America, the social fabric, the middle ground between man and state. I mean, the state of the Christian church should, I think, matter for the wider community. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that the broader community, the broader context of American society has a deeply vested interest in the health of religious communities, that these are on-the-ground institutions that provide so much in the way of supporting individuals and families and holding up the good. And unfortunately, that part of the story isn't told as frequently. And so we tend to focus on the stories of churches or Christians who are behaving badly. And I think, it's interesting. We cannot exactly abstract faith in a time of COVID from the fact that 2020 was also a time of tremendous political dissension, tremendous racial tensions, and I am very curious, and we may never know the answer to this, but would January 6th ever have happened, or would we have had so many people buying into conspiratorial theories about the world if they had not been cut off from kind of their usual sources of community and meaning and hope over the course of 2020? And so is it possible that, having been in lockdown over the course of a year to greater and lesser extents kind of contributed to the collective insanity that, was expressed on January 6th? I think it's eminently possible that that's the case. But I think, my hope, and just want to say thank you to Leah and Alan, and to you, Michael, for your exquisite facilitation of this conversation. My hope is similar to what Leah expressed, that, I talk to some people who say, I don't really want to return to normalcy. I've learned some things in the midst of this that I don't want to forget. And I don't want to fall back into the same patterns where I have no time for the things that were really most important. So Kierkegaard, I wrote my dissertation on Kierkegaard. These are mostly Kierkegaard books behind me. He talks about the school of suffering, and are we willing to learn from suffering's instruction? So my hope is that my community and others can learn the lessons that are to be learned, plumb the depths of the last year, and carry that forward with us.
Well, that's a great point for sort of a final question, first to you, Alan, and then to Leah to wrap us up. What gives you hope, Alan, for faith coming out of COVID, faith after a time of COVID?
Difficult question for me. I might punt to Leah. My organization is not in the position of promoting faith or non-religion or any religion over any other. We just try to measure it. I do think that there's a really interesting question here, which is whether the American public and other publics around the world will become more religious, or portions of them will truly become more religious as a result of the suffering they're going through right now. And again, the interesting theory here is the theory sometimes called existential insecurity. If you're interested in it, you can read about it in a recent issue of Foreign Affairs, or go and read the books by various political scientists like Ronald Inglehart at the University of of Michigan or Pippa Norris at Harvard. And the idea, simply put, and it can be oversimplified, is that people tend to be more religious or need religion more when they feel dread and fear. Now, sometimes religious people don't like hearing that. It seems like it's an oversimplification of what religion gives to people. But it's an interesting sociological theory. If it's right, and I'm not propounding it, if it's right, then we ought to see a long-term effect here, a bounce in religiosity. I'm not sure we will, but we're trying to monitor it in the United States and around the world, and I'll keep you posted.
Leah, what gives you hope coming out of COVID?
I think, well, first I'm going to be looking forward to Alan and to the research. I'm going to be anxiously looking forward to that because the research informs how we make decisions going forward. But to answer your question, what gives me hope is the determination that so many people had to really consider the role of religion. And I think we came out stronger. It may be a reflection again of what Alan said, that religious people turned to religion, but Orthodox Jews are religious people. And I think that there was a reinforcement of faith. I think there was an understanding that without faith, we're sacrificing on meaning and purpose. And we've doubled down on educating our children in our faith, on attending services when they're available legally and safely. And I am very, very hopeful that will continue, and that conversations like these will enable us to explore what is the best way forward.
Leah, Tim, Alan, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and to our audience for being a part of this. I know we at MI will look forward to continuing to watch this, be a part of the conversation as well, and we hope that you continue to tune in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.